Hello and welcome to our third lesson. I decided to dedicate this lesson entirely to introducing you to Prophet Muhammad for two reasons. First of all, because he is so widely misunderstood. And second, because he is so important to the Sufi tradition. So he really deserves being looked at in a close manner. To begin with, I would like to ask you, what comes to your mind when you think of Prophet Muhammad? What are the images, the associations that come up in you? Maybe you take a moment and see what comes up. If you have a pen and paper next to you, you might even want to write down a few words. So, probably what you have on your mind right now, or on your piece of paper, is very likely not positive, critical maybe outrightly negative, but not necessarily what the Sufis would feel and think when they hear the name of Muhammad. And that's because our image of Muhammad has been shaped by centuries of bias. And this, of course, prevents us from seeing the spiritual Muhammad. So let's look a little bit at the common image of Muhammad in the West. No other founder of any religion has been represented so consistently negative as Muhammad. Not Jesus, not Buddha, not Moses, and no other religious figure. In fact, Muhammad has been under attack for 1,300 years, starting with his own lifetime, because he was persecuted by his own kin in Mecca. In medieval times, it was mostly Christian scholars and writers, among them prominently Martin Luther, who criticized Muhammad and even sometimes called him the Antichrist. Muhammad being an ignorant tribal warrior from the desert, a man of the sword who was violent in temper, in character, and someone who practiced polygamy. So there is a profound misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the person of Muhammad, owing mainly to the fact that Christians in medieval times saw Islam as a hostile religion, as something that came to lead people astray. Of course, Christianity, from their point of view, being the only true religion, the only way to salvation. Today also, it is often fundamentalist Christians, especially in the US, who attack Muhammad, call him a killer, evil, demonic, and the list goes on. You just need to do some research and look into the media. We also have all those cartoon controversies going on that are making the news about cartoons being drawn of the Prophet Muhammad, which has led Muslims, so this whole background has led Muslims to be very defensive about Muhammad, about their prophet, their beloved guide and prophet. As we are trying to do in this course, we want to travel from the outside appearance and all those polarizations to the core of Muhammad's life and teachings. So why is Muhammad beloved by Muslims, particularly by the Sufis? This is the question that will be guiding us. And when we understand this, when we find an answer to this question, we can maybe also understand how Muslims nowadays sometimes take extreme offense when their prophet is publicly insulted. Saying this, of course, I don't want to justify any of those overreactions, because the spiritual ideal of Islam would be to stay in your center without reacting or blaming anyone for their ignorance. And of course, the acts of violence that have occurred based on Muslims defending their prophet, so especially with the cartoon controversies, those acts cannot be justified in any way. I mean, that goes without saying. And they are completely contrary to the spirit of Islam and the spirit of Sufism. I want to read a paragraph from Omid Safi's book, Memories of Muhammad, a very readable account of the Prophet's life and how he is understood. He writes, "For me, Muhammad is above all else, rahmatun il alamin, a source of mercy to all the worlds, as the Quran proclaims him, and the Nabi al-Rahmah, the Prophet of mercy, as the Muslims have remembered him. For me, Muhammad represents the completion of the possibilities available to us as human beings, not because he is superhuman, but precisely because he embodies the meaning of what it means to be fully human. The fullness of his humanity is particularly important to me in his life as the ideal father, husband, friend, leader, and prophet. He ascended to God and out of compassion returned to lead others so that they too might ascend to God." So let's start by looking at Muhammad's life. We have a lot of information about his life story because big efforts were made to preserve his biography. So we actually know more about Muhammad than about any other religious founder. Muhammad was born in the year 570 in Mecca, what is now Saudi Arabia, into a tribal society, his own tribe being the tribe of the Quraysh. Muhammad's father died before he was born, and his mother passed away when he was 6 years old. So he spent most of his childhood and youth as an orphan. That's why probably he had a rather melancholic and contemplative time as a child, being raised by his uncle Abu Talib. And this position as an orphan in a desert society at an early age made Muhammad identify with the poor and the disadvantaged parts of society. Mecca at that time was an important trade city, and Muhammad's own tribe, the Quraysh, was one of the most wealthy tribes of Arabia. So as a youth, Muhammad started to work as an agent for wealthy merchants who were taking goods around the Arab Peninsula. When he was 25 years old, a woman named Khadija, who was a merchant, a well-known merchant, asked Muhammad to take her caravan to Syria. Seeing his trustworthiness and his good character, Khadija, after Muhammad had successfully carried out the job, asked Muhammad to marry her. Now, Muhammad was 25 and Khadija was 15 years older, 40 years old. So it was quite an unconventional marriage. And Khadija was a woman of power, an emancipated woman, as we would say nowadays. So that already was quite an exceptional match in in the Meccan society at that time. So Khadija and Muhammad had 6 children, 4 daughters and 2 sons, all of which died as infants. Sometimes Muhammad used to retreat into the cave of Al-Hira. So his contemplative life was already strong, even before he received his first revelation. And it was during one of those retreats in the cave Al-Hira, at the age of 40, when suddenly he heard a voice speak to him. Iqra, read. He was shocked and he said, I'm not able to recite. But the words just kept coming. It is said that he ran out of the cave, he looked into the sky, and the sky was filled with angels. Still, he couldn't believe what he was experiencing, and totally shocked, in terror, he came down and he went to seek solace from his wife Khadija, thinking that maybe he's possessed or demons have taken possession of him. So, what is Khadija's reaction? She first of all consoles him and then takes him to Waraqa. Waraqa is a Christian who knows about such things. And Waraqa says, your experience is authentic, Muhammad. So Waraqa is the first one who confirms Muhammad's mission. And at the same time warns him that he will have a very rough time presenting this new revelation to his fellow tribesmen. Now, Muhammad was illiterate, as most people in the Arab society, and in a deeper sense, his illiteracy guaranteed that he was a true and pure vessel, not tainted by any intellectual knowledge, so that he could receive God's revelation. It's sometimes even compared to Mary being a virgin in the Christian symbology, meaning that Mary was the pure vessel to receive Jesus. In the same way, Jesus was the pure, Muhammad was the pure receptor of that divine message coming through. After some time, Muhammad receives another revelation saying that he now needs to make this message public. And of course, he's extremely scared of how people will react to this very novel revelation. And you must know that the Arabic of the Quran, the language that Muhammad received and heard from the voice of the Archangel Gabriel, who dictated all those verses to him, that Arabic is of extraordinary otherworldly beauty. It has a very certain rhythm. It is very eloquent. It rhymes in certain parts. And many in the community in Mecca converted to Islam precisely because of this beautiful language, saying this language must be of divine origin. It can't have originated from a human being. So this being a validation for the authenticity of Muhammad's message. So Muhammad began reciting those verses, those surahs that he received to the community, and it was preserved in the memory of people and then also written down by those who knew how to write, which was a minority at that time. Of course, not all people accepted this message. Actually, rather few people accepted it. And Muhammad had to face serious resistance because he threatened the status quo of society in Mecca at that time. How was that society functioning? It was, first of all, a very capitalist system, so not very different from our times. And people were totally focused on materialism. So there was no social welfare, no care for the poor. It was all about money, about trade, about increasing your riches. And Muhammad, being highly morally sensitive and receiving messages of social justice, of solidarity with the poor, gave those messages to his people to care for the poor, to have compassion with the weak, to strive for justice and equity. In Mecca at that time, women were treated as second-class citizens. They were even traded as slaves, like cattle in the market. The Quran, for the first time in the Arab society, established a set of rights for women, treating them as human beings, just like men. Probably the most radical message that Muhammad brought was to nullify the gods of the Kaaba. The Kaaba being that sacred place, Sanctum Sanctorium, since the time of Abraham, that was at the center of Mecca and was an important source of income for the Meccans. And in the Kaaba, there was a whole array of different statues and gods. And Muhammad, receiving the revelation of God's unity, you remember, La ilaha illallah, said, we have to make away with all those gods. He basically said, you have to destroy your statues, your gods. And this was a huge threat to the status quo because a lot of material wealth came from people visiting Mecca and visiting those gods and doing their supplication to those gods. So soon there were two camps in Mecca: those who followed Muhammad and those who strongly opposed his mission. Whole families split apart when children converted to Islam, and by time, hostilities increased. Initially, Muhammad had the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, but then misfortune struck, and there was a famine that destroyed all the property of Abu Talib. At the same time, Khadija, Muhammad's wife, died, leaving him completely alone, followed by the death of Abu Talib himself. Now Muhammad was all by himself, feeling weak and vulnerable. It was a time that we can call his dark night of the soul, the low point of his mission. And that was a period when he was about in his early 50s. So his mission had been going on for 10 years. At that point, Muhammad has a very central mystical experience called the Miraj. It is said that Muhammad fell asleep near the Kaaba, and in his sleep, he is taken into the heavens to meet God. And this meeting is prepared by the Archangel Gabriel, who accompanies him. And they open up his body and purify his heart by removing all traces of error, doubt, and idolatry, filling his inside with wisdom and belief. So this event, the Miraj, in which Muhammad in one night is being transported by Buraq, a mythical horse, all the way from Mecca to Jerusalem, to the Dome of the Rock, to meet the prophets and then appear before God. This event is very important for the Sufis because it becomes a metaphor of the spiritual ascension that each seeker in his life is longing to undergo himself or herself. So rather than asking ourselves with a positivist mindset, did this really happen? Did this really occur? We can look at the essence, at the symbology of this anecdote, the Miraj, a very important occurrence in the life of the Prophet. As the hostilities increase and there is a plot to assassinate Muhammad by different clans, and a number of youth from those clans come to the house of Muhammad to kill him, he receives a message from Gabriel that he needs to escape and leave Mecca as soon as possible for the city of Yathrib, which was later called Medina. And this event, which also marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, is called the Hijrah, the Great Migration. Arriving in Yathrib with his community, Muhammad established the first Muslim community. Now, Yathrib was already a cosmopolitan city with different tribes, different religious groups. And Muhammad, with his skills of negotiation, with his winning character that he already displayed as a merchant back when he was leading caravans through Mecca, he begins to make peace between those tribes. And he even drafts a constitution for Yathrib, becoming the first head of state of a Muslim community. So his legacy at that time, during the time in Yathrib, is really the legacy of a peacemaker and of a statesman, of a wise statesman who made agreements between the tribes. One of those agreements being that if any attack comes from outside, all the citizens of Yathrib, no matter which group they belong to, if they are pagan, Jewish, or Muslims, they will come together to defend their city. So early on, Muhammad teaches locals to transcend their tribal borders. A very important message for today. Now, the immigrants from Mecca, who are strangers, are being housed and hosted by the people of Yathrib and seen as neighbors. And even Muhammad established a system of pairing locals with the immigrants. The locals, they are called the helpers or al-ansar, and the immigrants, they are the muhajirun. So Medina, very soon, that's the name that Yathrib took on, Medina, the city, very soon became a model of a perfect city according to Islamic values. A place for people to live up to the ideals of Islam. And most of all, there is this sense of a shared humanity, of the Ummah, the community of believers. We are all connected to one another, and we are all responsible for each other. Soon the first mosque is built in Medina. And that place becomes the gathering place for the growing community of believers, of the Mu'minun. Now, in Islam, it is forbidden to begin a war. Fighting is only practiced when it is necessary, and it is not used as the first means. So, if there are other ways to resolve a conflict, those means are preferred. But at the same time, oppression in the eyes of Muslims is worse than going to war. So, faced with this continuous threat from Mecca, Muhammad receives the message that he needs to begin his life as a warrior. The first military engagement against a Meccan caravan happens in the Battle of Al-Badr. And this battle is followed by a series of battles. The Battle of Uhud, which is a horrible battle in which many of Muhammad's companions die, and many women become widows. Here, that's just a side note, we have suddenly a revelation coming that says that men can take several women as their wives. This revelation, this verse, this surah that comes, is owing to the fact that many women remained without men because the men died in the war. But men taking on different wives can only be practiced at one condition, which is that you have to love and care for your women equally. So this accusation of polygamy in Islam actually has to be seen against the background of a very specific historical situation, which is that many women were widowed because of the wars. So the permission to polygamy here is an act of faith and solidarity and not an act of lust, as it is often displayed. So this is very important to know. Muhammad's own harem was a matter of state affairs. So it was about creating political alliances between different tribes through marrying women from different tribes and families. So we always need to keep in mind the social order of Arab society at that time. So Muhammad, being a very skilled leader and statesman, knew how to create those bonds and how to maintain peace also through marrying, through including his personal life and interweaving it with the social level. Now, for a good reason for us nowadays, it is very difficult to understand and to justify the kind of violence that was normal in Arabia at that time, particularly when the Battle of the Trench occurred and the Muslims killed about 700 Jews as traitors. Coming from a tribe within Medina, they were perceived as internal enemies because they were secretly working against Muhammad's men and cooperating with the Meccans. So there were dangerous enemies, and the killing of those traitors has to be seen against that background, not as a kind of anti-Semitism as such, because it has been interpreted in that way by Jews in modern times. But as I said, it is not easy for us with a modern pacifist understanding to come to terms with these more bloody episodes of early Islam. Now, let me tell one episode that is important because it underlines Muhammad's view of warfare. It is when, after one of those battles, the warriors were returning home, and Muhammad said to them, "Now we have finished the lesser battle." And people were surprised because this was a particularly brutal battle. And Muhammad said, "Now it is time to move to the greater battle." The greater battle is called the Jihad al-Akbar. And jihad here really means the inner battle, the battle of the human being against his own ego, against his nafs, against his negative tendencies. We have the very same imagery in the Bhagavad Gita, the important Hindu scripture, which, by the way, also is set in a brutal war. And here again, we have the metaphor of man's fight against his ego, against his lower nature. So whereas in Mecca, Muhammad preached nonviolence, the teachings in his later life, when he lived in Medina with the Muslim proto-community, was a turn away from pacifism, recognizing that there was a time for war as well as a time for peace, like in the Bible. And the Quran also says in the second surah, "Fighting is ordained for you, even though it be hateful to you." But there are certain rules for fighting, and Muhammad again and again specified what was allowed at war and what had to be avoided. Fighting was to be performed in a noble way, which meant, first of all, that you could not kill women, children, and the elderly, except when they were trying to kill Muslims. Also, it was forbidden to kill religious leaders like monks or hermits, and you had to avoid killing non-combatant civilians. Non-combatant civilians. And that's, of course, nowadays also of particularly important when we speak of modern warfare, and especially of the terror done in the name of Islam by certain groups. So you can actually prove with the Islamic sources that their acts are clearly forbidden according to Islam. But because of a lack of the tradition, they follow the ignorance of their own image of Islam. So war for Muhammad and the early Muslims was a divine necessity for the survival of the message of the Quran. Otherwise, that's my assumption, Islam would never have grown into the tradition that it has become, including Sufism. I also want to emphasize that Gandhi had a deep respect for Muhammad. He studied the Quran and he spent plenty of time in dialogue with Muslims. He had to actually often negotiate between Muslims and Hindus whenever terrible communal violence flared up in India. And Gandhi argued that indeed some passages from the Quran can be quoted, which are contrary to peace. But he said similar ones could also be found in other religions, including Christianity and Hinduism. And Gandhi always asserted that the central teaching of Muhammad was a teaching of peace. And this is a quote from one of his writings. I wanted to know the best of the life of one, Muhammad, who holds today an undisputed sway over the hearts of millions of mankind. I became more than ever convinced that it was not the sword that won a place for Islam in those days in the scheme of life. It was the rigid simplicity, the utter self-effacement of the Prophet, the scrupulous regard for pledges, his intense devotion to his friends and followers, his intrepidity, his fearlessness, his absolute trust in God and in his own mission. These, and not the sword, carried everything before them and surmounted every obstacle. After warding off the Meccan armies, Muhammad sent a community of 1,000 men to Mecca for the pilgrimage. And this was a brilliant strategy because the Meccans could not forbid the Muslims to enter the Haram, the sacred area around the Kaaba. So for some time, the Muslims, the enemies of the Meccans, waited in front of the city. And at some point, the Meccans had to give in, and the Muslims could enter the sacred precincts. They went and destroyed the idols, and they granted the Meccans amnesty, calling an end to the vendetta, to the bloody conflicts that had taken so many lives. Muhammad's mission was complete, and he died in the year 632. He had no successor, and as always, when a master dies, there were splits in the early days of Islam. So, in the absence of the founding figure of the master, all those different groups emerged, new wars came up, and over time, his message of truthfulness was diluted. But I won't go into all those historical details that will take us too far away from our lesson today. So this was by no means a perfect account of Muhammad's life. I'm not a historian, so please forgive any flaws in this account. But I thought it was important to just present you with an overview so we know who we are talking about. And to bring some color into this lesson, I would like to show you a few miniatures from one of the historical accounts of Muhammad's life. Miniature paintings being one of the important art forms of Islam. So here in the first image, we can see how some of the fellow Meccans are throwing stones at Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad here in the green robe and his face covered with a white veil. We know that the depiction of Prophet Muhammad is not practiced in Islamic art in most cases, But we have some cases in Persian miniature where his face is actually shown. So yeah, this scene shows the kind of hostilities that Muhammad had to face from his own tribesmen. The second miniature painting, and we see here a very classical Islamic manuscript, a composition of both writing in Arabic and beautiful, intricate miniature painting. So here in the second example, we have the Archangel Gabriel in beautiful colors, delivering a message to Muhammad, the message that he needs to leave Mecca as soon as possible. Otherwise, he would be killed. Here again, we have the Archangel Gabriel, this time standing in front of Muhammad, who is sitting under a mihrab, a prayer niche, and learning the call to prayer from Gabriel. And in the last painting, we have a scene of Muhammad seated in front of his community in Medina and teaching Islam to them. So let's talk about Muhammad as a prophet. There are 25 prophets mentioned in the Quran that came before him. And one hadith even speaks of as many as 124,000 prophets. So prophets being those guides of mankind that are sent by God in different places, in different cultures to guide humanity. And of course, Buddha also can be seen as a prophet. The avatars of Hinduism were prophets, and so on and so forth. Muhammad is the last prophet according to Islam, also called the seal of prophethood, because with his death, the prophetic cycle came to an end. So Islam, in that perspective, came to complete the two Abrahamic religions before, Judaism and Christianity. Muhammad, despite his important function as a prophet, always warned his followers not to make him into God. He was a human being like everyone else, but a perfected human being, a perfect man, or insan kamil, as it is called in Arabic. And at the same time, he was a role model in many aspects, as a merchant, as a father and husband, as a statesman, as a warrior, and as a prophet. So Muhammad, in his personality, deeply fuses political, social, and spiritual dimensions of life. And that's the important difference to Christ, who is also considered one of the most important prophets in Islam. Whereas the Christians considered Christ divine, Muhammad is a human being. Whereas Christ did not participate in the ordinary affairs of human life, Muhammad, as we just saw, had all these different hats, all these different roles. The Christians sometimes were confused and they asked the Muslims, Muhammad's life was so worldly. He had wives, he had his business, he went to war. So how is it even possible to follow him spiritually? So to answer these questions, we need to understand that all those aspects of life in which Muhammad was active serve as a model for Muslims, as something to imitate. So this is called the outer aspect of Muhammad. The inner aspect, the inner life, is found in Muhammad's relationship with God, his frequent prayers, his spiritual practices, his fasting, his constant remembrance of God, and all his sayings about how the human being is to relate to God and surrender on the path of Islam. All these traditions and all these sayings are collected in what is called the Sunnah, or the tradition. So Muslims turn to the Sunnah, to the practices of Muhammad, for daily guidance. Of course, the Quran also provides important guidance, but not in all aspects of people's lives. So the Sunnah comes to complete the Quran. So during Muhammad's lifetime, it was important for his companions to carefully observe his acts, his words, his personal qualities, his habits of daily living, certain practices that he approved of, and other customs that he disapproved of, or matters that he just stayed silent on. So all these parameters came to be recorded in what is called the hadith, or the sayings and the traditions of the Prophet. The science of the hadith, the transmission of those sources, became a central discipline in the Islamic world, being taught in madrasas in Iran and Iraq especially, and other parts of the Islamic world, later also in Anatolia and Turkey, and of course in South Asia, and so on. In this tradition of hadith, the transmitting of anecdotes and sayings of Prophet Muhammad, you generally differentiate between so-called weak hadith and strong hadith. Some of those traditions have a chain of transmission that is considered weak, and some of them, they are stronger. And sometimes Sufis would use those so-called weak traditions, which would then in turn enrage the more orthodox, law-minded Muslims who said that this is not authentic, this is not true. And so you always also have these conflicts about what actually constitutes the Sunnah. But of course, there is a whole set of hadith which makes up the core of Islamic teachings and which is undisputed. Ibn Arabi, the great master of Sufism, continued to study the hadith until the end of his life. And of course, it goes without saying that also Rumi was deeply steeped in the knowledge of hadith. The Sunnah was not only about outwardly imitating the Prophet, but also trying to realize the inner states of Muhammad. And this, of course, is the domain of the Sufis. What are those qualities? What are those inner states of the Prophet? Inner strength, nourished by a great faith in God. And of course, he had to have this strength, given all the challenges that, as you have seen, he had to face during his life. Another quality is his strong presence, being awake, free from daydreaming of ordinary men, always remaining attentive and vigilant. Beauty is one of those qualities. He was a man beautifully inward and outward. Simplicity. Muhammad had a very simple life in his house. And that also, of course, brought a deep sense of humility, but an authentic kind of humility, not a humility as it is sometimes used to hide one's ego. He was a very kind and loving man. That's what we see in the hadith, full of kindness and love and generosity, not only towards humans, but also towards animals. He was sincere and truthful. He had a complete surrender before the truth. and made it a point to always remain on the side of truth, no matter what the consequences were. So here we find a very different image from what has been conveyed in the Western world. Muhammad really being the supreme guide towards the love and knowledge of God. And as the Quran states again and again, to obey God, one has to obey his messenger, meaning really following his ways, following his qualities, following his acts, and seeking to cultivate those qualities in yourself. And that's why Muslims have prayers and supplications at every possible occasion. First of all, during the 5 ritual prayers, but also apart from that, during celebrations and just always evoking the Prophet Muhammad and sending blessings on his soul and on his family. In a way, the love of the Prophet that was deeply felt by the Sufis has been the strongest binding force of Muslims in all cultures, whether they be simple farmers or state officials. And towards the 12th century, a broad movement of devotion to the Prophet Muhammad appeared in Muslim countries. And this tradition of devotion often emerged in Sufi circles. So you had songs and poems written in praise of the Prophet. In some countries, especially in North Africa, the celebration of Muhammad's birthday, the Maulid, became an established holiday. And children in many parts of the Islamic world still grow up learning stories about Muhammad's life and poems in their mother tongue. Most of the Islamic world, of course, not being able to speak Arabic, so you have all those poems about Muhammad in Turkish or in Urdu or Indonesian. And he appears in stories and lullabies, making a profound impact, of course, on many generations of Muslims. So let me show you one of the more popular examples of actually a classical Turkish poem in praise of Muhammad that has a recurring line that goes like this. Adı güzel, kendi güzel Muhammed. Thy name is beautiful. You are yourself beautiful, O Muhammad. Let's play this song performed by Emre Sertkaya.
Canım kurban olsun dost dost senin yoluna, senin yoluna. Adı güzel kendi dost dost güzel Muhammed, güzel Muhammed. Söylenirsin cümle dost dost alem dilinde, alem dilinde. Adı güzel, kendi güzel Muhammed dost dost. Adı güzel, kendi güzel Muhammed.
Now, what is of particular relevance to us is how Muhammad is perceived in the context of Sufism beyond the historical figure who he was. Let me start by saying that Muhammad would not share his esoteric teachings with everyone. He would not just speak out his wisdom to all audiences, but only share the inner meaning of Islam with his close companions. Those companions, as we already said, they are called the Sahaba. And from that root, Sahaba, you can derive the word suhba, spiritual companionship, and sohbet, sohbat, or sohbet in Turkish pronunciation, which is a sort of divine discourse, a discourse, inspired discourse in a circle of spiritual friends, satsang, as it is called in the Indian tradition. So Muhammad would give sohbat to his followers, and according to his audience and depending on the person he was speaking to, he would talk on different levels. And he would sometimes respond to the same question in different ways according to what that person needed to hear, as all great masters have the ability to do. About 300 people lived in the mosque of the Prophet and dedicated themselves to the religious practices. So they were, let's say, the core circle of early Muslims. If we move to a more subtle and symbolic level, Muhammad in the Sufi doctrine is seen as the prima materia, the first being that was created, a light that existed since the beginning of time. Now, that is a little hard to understand or to grasp at first, but let's look at a few of the more enigmatic statements of Muhammad. He said, I was already a prophet when Adam was between the spirit and the body. I was already a prophet when Adam was between the spirit and the body. Another saying, I am the first man to be created and the last to be sent as a prophet. The Sufis here speak of the Muhammadian Light or the Nur al-Muhammadi, which was there in the beginning and then got passed on from one prophet to the next until it finally incarnated in the physical form of Muhammad as a human being. Sufis sometimes experienced a vision of this light in their retreats, so it is an important element on their spiritual path. They also use the term al-haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya, or the Muhammadan reality, as a metaphysical principle to guide them on their path. In the Sufi orders, Muhammad is always seen as the supreme guide of the spiritual path. So Sufis always are aware that they belong to the path of Muhammad. Some even prefer to say that we are Muhammadi instead of we are Muslims. In the same way, the Sufi masters, the sheikhs, were always aware that they were drawing their spiritual power, their barakah, from the Prophet himself, and that they are mere representatives or proxies of him on earth. The silsila, or the chain of masters, safeguards the authenticity of this path and passes on this Muhammadan light from one generation to the next so that it can radiate upon the disciples, upon the aspirants on the path. So spiritual guidance in Sufism is always made alive by this subtle bond that goes back to the spiritual being of the Prophet. And having dreams of the Prophet is always considered a very important form of guidance for any Muslim. And even more so, which happened to some Sufis, if you have visions of the Prophet in the waking state, if he appears to you. One Sufi called Suyuti even claimed to have seen the Prophet more than 70 times in his life. And I would like to finish, as it is our tradition, with a poem by Rumi, first in Persian and then in English. من بنده قرآنم اگر جان دارم، من خاک در محمد مختارم، گر نقل کند جز این کس از گفتارم، بیزارم از او وز این سخن بیزارم. I am a servant of the Quran as long as I have a soul. I am dust on the path of Muhammad, the chosen one. If anyone quotes anything other than this from my sayings, I deplore that person. I deplore his words.